Hi, Dr. T. It's so great to see you today. Thank you so much for taking out the time to meet with me and to record this session for our participants of the Leadership Accelerator for Women program on this very important topic of building your personal, professional leadership brand. I've had the opportunity to now know you for a few years and have had the opportunity to work with you. And as I've told you, I think you're one of the most strongest and most strategic HR leaders that I know. In fact, the first time we met was when I had the opportunity to facilitate a C-suite offsite for your organization. And right from the very beginning, I was blown away by your presence, how you showed up in that meeting, how you commanded the room. You came across as a very strong and decisive leader. So for those of the participants who don't know you, can you share a little bit about your background and your leadership journey up to this point and how that has defined your leadership brand?
Yeah, well, first I want to say thank you for inviting me to be part of this. It's been, we've had a great journey together, right? And you mentioned how we met at a very critical point of, our journey as an organization with DC Central Kitchen and our strategic planning and our human capital design. And so a big part of my where I am now is with DC Central Kitchen. I think everything I've done in my career, my 20-year career in human resources is has culminated into my current role as a Chief Human Capital Officer with DC Central Kitchen. And so for me, my journey began, it started in operations, if you can believe it, but I quickly recognized and identified that the part that I enjoyed most in operations management for sure was the systems, but I really, really had a strong interest in the people that I worked with. And I felt like even as a manager then, my thing was, well, how do I create systems to ensure that I'm always consistently engaging, I'm always consistently developing, I'm always consistently connecting with the people I work with. And so I transitioned into human resources because I thought, well, if I could do this with this small team that I'm responsible for, I want to do this for the entire organization. And at the time, the company I was working with was able to lend. I was able to essentially transition in that space. And so with time, I just continued to grow within human resources and the different elements of it, right? So oftentimes when people think human resources, they think about the transactional elements, the processes, the systems, which again, I love. But for me, they were all the systems and the processes and the procedures, those transactions are always a means to an end. For me, it's about, how are we connecting and engaging and developing people? And at some point in my journey, so at some point in my professional journey, I went to business school, right? Because I wanted to just look for ways that I think at the time I was thinking, okay, I've spent quite a bit of time working for other organizations. Perhaps I could go into entrepreneurship, start my consulting firm. And so that's what the MBA did for me. But while I was at Georgetown, I got introduced to this concept of a social entrepreneurship, right? The idea of, organizations who essentially not only exist to drive social change, but they also have this smart business model where they're able to sustain themselves financially as well. And so sometime after that, I discovered DC Central Kitchen. I discovered the wonderful opportunity that I now have, and I've been in for the last 6 years as Chief Human Capital Officer. So in my current role, I'm responsible for, essentially, I oversee all of our talent strategy, right? And at the time that I joined the organization, a lot of what they were looking to do was to build an infrastructure, right? That would allow them to do what it is that they were looking to do, which is essentially make DC Central Kitchen a space where folks saw themselves growing, a space where you know, staff felt fulfilled doing the work and felt connected to the mission. And of course, the opportunity was in line with my personal interests. But with time, I, you know, spent a lot of time essentially building these reward and recognition systems, building, you know, creating processes and strategies to attract, retain, and develop diverse talent, right? So a lot of systems building. And as a result of that, the organization felt like, well, okay, well, why don't we apply some of these this lens that, you know, we've been able to support our HR strategies and practices with, to volunteer engagement. And so as recently as last year, volunteer engagement became part of my portfolio. And as we get ready to move into our brand new building, which is in this beautiful space down by the waterfront in Southwest, we're going to have guest experience also under, you know, human resources under my portfolio. So as I talk about my journey, one of the things I'm sure you could probably sense that I kept using the term systems building, right? That's my thing. Like that's the one thing I'm known for. When you talk about a leadership brand, especially now and where I am in my career, I'm called in for that specific thing, right? So I'm known as a strategic thinker. I'm known as a systems thinker. I'm known to pay attention to the big picture. And I tend to spend a lot of time really understanding what that big picture is at the macro level. And then on the micro level, another extension, another way sort of my brand represents itself is as a facilitator of talents, right? Because I understand that as you build these systems, and they don't build themselves, right? People build them, right? And the way, first and foremost, the way that you implement lasting change and the way that you implement lasting impact is essentially by building systems with vested stakeholders. And so the vested stakeholders essentially are the talent. It's the talent you're working with. And so the other thing that I tend to do is I spend a lot of time just observing, getting to understand the people on the team, getting to understand who's occupying the seats at the table. And then I look for ways that, you know, we make sure that everyone who is showing up is showing up essentially at their best selves, in the best version of their selves. What is it that they enjoy doing, but also what is it that they are known to do, right? What is the value add that they're bringing to the table, and making sure that we're creating an optimal environment so that everyone who's showing up to do this thing is essentially being placed in a space that aligns well with what it is they do, right? Because when we don't do it that way, or if it's just let's just jump in there and do whatever, it's a missed opportunity for the specific project and for the specific idea. But I think it's also a missed opportunity for the individual who was brought in to do a specific thing, right? So for sure, systems thinker, for sure, facilitator of talents. But a final thing, and I'd say it was probably one of the earliest attributes that my peers and people who are familiar with my work noticed. And this is, I think, before I had assumed the specific position or title of leader. And that is my role on a team as a consensus builder, right? So in team settings, I actively work to listen, to hear, to understand the perspectives, the voices, you know, the motivations, the ideas of people in the room, right? And for me, it's about creating a space where these people feel, well, one, creating a space where I understand what these motivations are, but it's also about creating a space where folks feel comfortable expressing the ideas and motivations. And then the final piece of that is creating a space where everyone can hear the ideas, the pain points, the motivations, and the interests of everybody else in the room, right? Because I think doing that, the project that we're working on ends up being that much better, right? Because we're exposed to that many more ideas and ways that things could be improved, or ways to avoid these shortfalls. So in a nutshell, the way I would describe my leadership brand is as a consensus building, systems thinking facilitator of talents, right? So it's those three things. But if I was to if I was to sell my label, that's what my label would say, right?
Yeah.
So
That's
that,
your elevator pitch.
that is, that is,
That's your 5 seconds
that's it.
or less elevator pitch. I love it. And what I love about your articulation of your brand, Dr. T, is that these attributes, right, that you've used to define your brand, they're so rooted in your understanding of your strengths, your values, right? Your beliefs, right? How you want to contribute in this world. So it's not just surface level. There, the roots go deep, right? And you've articulated, you've refined and polished into this amazing brand that you have right now.
Right.
And it's interesting that we're not taught to think about our brand or curate and cultivate our brand. That's not something we learn in business school or any type of school, right?
Right.
Yet we know that, especially in a workplace, in professional life, your brand could be such a strategic differentiator when it comes to getting the right types of opportunities, growing in your career, any of that. You know, Dr. T, as someone who is really thought about and developed this really strong brand, why is it important for women leaders to cultivate and nurture their leadership brand?
Yeah, I think now more than ever, and I think increasingly so as, as just things progress, right? I think
Mhm.
it's very important that we as women have brands that are readily accessible, right? And what
Mhm.
I mean by that is ultimately leadership is an outward facing thing, right? As
Mhm.
leaders, we're serving others. And
Mhm.
so if we say that there are seats at the table that we're looking to occupy, right? It's important that those that are building the table, those that are creating spaces at the table
Mhm.
are able. So it's not a matter. I think it's a difference between us waiting to be invited to the table
Mhm.
versus the creators of the table understanding that they need us to be at the table, right?
Mhm.
So if I'm putting together a team of people and I need them, and I know on this team, I have a variety of perspectives. I know that people are coming from different backgrounds. I know that
Mhm.
I'm going to need a consensus builder. I know that I'm going to need that role. And
Mhm.
if I've been proactive about nurturing and cultivating this brand as a consensus builder,
Mhm.
I wouldn't have to wait, right? These
Yeah.
invitations would come to me because I've put it out there. I've put out to potential consumers of my brand that this is
Mhm.
what I'm about,
Mhm.
right? So I think it's important for us to, first of all, be able to identify what our leadership brand is,
Mhm.
refine it, right?
Mhm.
And then continue to curate, cultivate, nurture it so that those who will be consuming our brand, those who will be benefiting from what it is that we bring to the table, are able to reach out and tap in,
Mhm.
almost very easily. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So
Yeah.
I think that really is the, for me, that is the best way for us to position ourselves in this time of urgency,
Yeah.
right? Like there's a growing sense of urgency about the need. um so it's no longer a nice to have, it's a need to have.
Need
Inclusive
to have.
leadership is a need. Having women at the table is a need. Having women build the table is a need, right?
Yeah.
Having
Yeah.
people of color and people from diverse backgrounds is a need if you're trying to lead successfully, if you're trying to build a system, whether it's government, public
Mhm.
policy, private sector, schools, whatever it is, there is a need for women at the table.
Yeah.
And so I think for us, the work for us would be being able to, have our brands readily accessible, readily digestible,
Mhm.
ready for people to know, okay, if this is gonna need to work, this table is
Yeah.
gonna need legs.
Mhm.
Who would be a great leg? Who would be a great tabletop? Who would be a great person to come up with, who has the brand of innovative problem solving? Who
Yep.
has the
Mhm.
brand of collaborator? You know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Mhm.
And so, because it's gonna come, right?
Yeah.
You're needed somewhere. And
Yeah.
so it just works a lot easier, I think, or
Yeah.
at least in a less challenging way, because there are always going to be challenges, if your brand is something that people have come to know. And I think that essentially for me is the need to cultivate this brand and nurture this brand for others.
I love the analogy of, of not only being invited to sit on the table, but actually right now is the need for us to actually be part of building that table. So it has the right fit for us as well. And I think many people, women especially, we often misconstrue the act of cultivating or curating your brand as us bragging. But that's not the case. It's not about bragging. It's, as you said, it's getting people to know about you, to know what you have to offer, right? So you're actually doing a service to others around you, so they know what to tap you for. And I love that. We also know that a brand, it is composed of many different dimensions. You have the inanimate parts of your brand. So those are your accomplishments, your achievements that you put out there. And brand is also comprised of how you are showing up and who you have relationships with, right? Your strategic partnerships, your strategic relationships. How have you polished, or what do you do to polish these inanimate or more of those animate aspects of your brand, more than just accomplishments, right? More than just titles.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think for me, it always starts with the innate aspects of your brand. I think your brand is anchored in those things that you do naturally, right? So I believe earlier I talked about my role as a consensus builder. And I talked about my role as a systems thinker and as a facilitator of talents. And I believe that even if I was a doctor, I would still be known as a consensus building, systems thinking facilitator of talents, right? That's just how I've always shown up as far back as I can remember. And even before, I mean, now it's more of a reflective thing, like, of course, but coming up, I didn't know that I necessarily have these things. It took other people pointing out and saying, hey, you're particularly good at this thing, right? And so I think in that ongoing cultivation, or that ongoing evolution of your branding approach, the way you build onto it, I think the distinction or what shapes your priority would be, I think I also use the term consumers, right? Who are you marketing to? What seat are you eyeing, and what is it that they're looking for, right? So again, I mentioned three things: my current brand and what it is that I showcase now: consensus builder, systems thinker, facilitator of talent. But what if there was this other project that was near and dear to my heart, and I happen to know that what they're actually looking for, the brand they're looking for, is an innovative problem solver, right? But I haven't quite cultivated or shaped my brand in that way where I'm speaking their language, right? And so the work for me then becomes, well, how do I translate my consensus building, my systems thinking, and my facilitating of talent in service of coming up with innovative solutions? Like, how do I make that connection? How do I convey that? How do I express that? How do I start to express that? And I think with time, this brand that I've cultivated through the years just gets to be shaped or looked at a little bit differly, right? But it's still anchored in essentially who I am, if that makes sense. It's still anchored in my raw talent, in my innate talent. It's still, I will still be building consensus even if I was solving problems or coming up with innovative solutions. And the way I would come up with those innovative solutions would still be to listen to the voices in the room, right? So I think a big part of that brand, that leadership brand evolution or development or refinement of whatever you call it, oftentimes it's shaped by the context of your environment, where you are now. But I think it's also a matter of where it is you're looking to go. There's an element of it, so it's outward facing, but it's also forward thinking, right? And so it's always a dynamic process in terms of the way it's being expressed, in terms of the way you're adding onto it. So to your point about adding on to those accomplishments, or adding on to, the strategic partnerships you're forging. I think that part is there's a forward thinking element to that aspect of it, where
Mm-hmm.
it's, you know, it's this is where I want to be in the next 3 years, and this is what they're looking for in the next 3 years. And so again, if you've been focusing and sort of catering to your current brand consumers, right, those
Mm-hmm.
that have needed your consensus building, you continue to do that, but then you also start to
Mm-hmm.
convey and express innovative problem solving to your potential consumers who you
Mm-hmm.
know would be
Mm-hmm.
looking for that in the next 3 years, right? So
Yeah.
for me, that's the dynamic that's constantly happening. Again, it's a function. I think the internal piece or the innate piece is who you are, right?
Yeah.
And it's that anchor and it's that foundation. But then the other aspects of it, whether it's the inanimate or whether it's the strategic partnerships, those become outward facing as well as, you know, forward looking.
Yeah, I heard two things you mentioned, Dr. T, which I loved. One is building a brand. It's almost what it sounds like, a strategic planning process. You have to identify your target, who you're targeting, the audience, what your goal, ultimate goal is, and then kind of shaping your brand towards that. But to build an authentic brand, and I'm using the word authentic because you can easily try to copy another brand, but to build an authentic brand, it starts with a greater self-awareness of your strengths, your abilities, right? Your, natural talents, your values, right? That as you use the word anchor multiple times, that's what's going to anchor your brand.
Right. That's the case. Absolutely.
So and the other word you used, which I think is so critical, you use priorities. So as you grow in your leadership journey, as a leader, you get to choose from multiple different priorities. How do you, as an executive leader, balance what you're committing to, the priorities that you take on, the opportunities you take on, with the type of brand that you have built and you want to cultivate? How do you balance that? How do you keep your brand in mind when you are, prioritizing the opportunities for yourself as a leader?
Yeah. No, that's good. I mean, I think one, it's important to be anchored, right? To be anchored. And I think that as you then make your branding malleable, right? Depending on what it is you are trying to target, depending on what the current priority is. I feel like as long as you're anchored in that authenticity, you will be okay, right? So for example, if I was to, and it's pretty hard to think of a leadership brand. Okay, I can think of one, right? So I'm not necessarily the one, I don't know how to work a room. I don't, that's never been my calling. So, but it's a strength and it's a brand and it's a calling for some people. And so because it's sort of, it's not my innate, it's not something that I've been able to, it's not part of the essence of who I am. It would be hard for me to, it's not impossible for me to do that. It's just the way I would do it would be rooted in how I naturally show up. So the way I would work a room would not necessarily be to command everyone's attention at the same time, but as a consensus builder, it would be to make connections in a very individual level, right? So eventually I will win over the room, but it will take just a little bit longer, but that's how I would do it. So I think the way that balance happens is you have your anchor and then you have your priorities. And I don't think that they should be, they should counter each other. They shouldn't be in tension or in direct conflict. I think they should work together. And I think that's where taking the time to strategically plan comes in, right? Because it's like, there is this thing there is this sort of, there is this priority that I need to meet. This is the goal. The goal is to win folks over. The goal is to work the room, but I can't necessarily do it you have to recognize that you can't necessarily do it the way others might do it.
Right.
And so that's where you kind of look back, you look at your anchor, you look at your values, you look at what it is that you uniquely bring to the table, and you marry the two, right?
Yeah.
And you come up with a balanced strategy that is rooted in your authenticity,
That's
and
right.
is positioned to pursue that priority in a fulfilling and satisfying manner. So I think for me,
Yeah.
that's how those two come together.
Yeah. No, I really like it. And it goes back to the importance of having your own authentic brand, right? Defining that rather than copying another brand out there, because it might not work for you and you might fail doing that. On the flip side, Dr. T, especially when you get to certain seniority level in an organization, I think any one of us who's been in executive position has come across situations where you might have to engage in a way that goes against or might risk uh, or putting your brand in a compromising position. How do you push back with that while protecting your brand
Yeah.
and fulfilling your duties as the leader of the organization?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think that's something that you come, well, for me, I think I became better at with
Mhm.
time, right?
Mhm.
And I'd like to say with experience, but I
Mhm.
think it's also the experience translates to greater confidence. Like once you spend time, I think that's where
Mhm.
the authenticity piece comes in. Because once you've spent time getting to know who you are and how you show up, once you spend time affirming yourself and being affirmed by others, and you're
Mhm.
comfortable with the foundation,
Mhm.
I think what that time and experience allows you to do is approach whatever the challenge is a little bit more confidently, but not
Mhm.
confrontationally, but
Mhm.
confidently, right?
Yeah.
But I think
Yeah.
another part of it is about, and this, I guess this is where consensus building comes in,
Mhm.
where oftentimes I'm looking to understand the motivation, truly understand the motivation of others, even if it is a countering opinion.
Yeah.
So when a person says no, right?
Mhm.
And they say no because usually it's a no because if they say no, it's I mean,
Mhm.
then that's where the confrontation, sometimes out of the conflict sometimes happen, but oftentimes, quite frankly, it's a no because, and I
Mhm.
listen, I truly seek to understand the individual motivation or a perspective of this person or the groups of people, right?
Mhm.
And the reason I do that is because if it is an idea or a project or something that I feel strongly enough, my goal is to translate the no becauses to yes if, right?
Mhm.
So or to understand that perhaps it was too much too soon, or
Mhm.
understand that perhaps the right resources were not available or present,
Mhm.
and that was the issue. Or sometimes, depending on the type of organization you work in, sometimes it's a function of not having the right sponsors or any sponsors attached to the idea, right? So
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
really a matter of paying attention to what essentially is happening. But I think this comes with time. I would say
Yeah.
at the onset of my career, the early years
Mhm.
in my career,
Mhm.
the defeats were a bit tougher.
Yeah.
All I heard was no, no period. I didn't hear
Yeah.
it wasn't a no comma because it was no. What?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
and so you kind of walk away feeling defeated. But I think what happens with time is that you just grow a little bit more confident in
Yeah.
who you are, right? So that the no's are not necessarily personal. Um, Sometimes it's just it's the right elements were not present at the
Yeah.
time the conversation was being had, and I look to listen to
Yeah.
those, and sometimes they could still be disappointing. Sometimes it could be you still feel disappointed. I don't want to undermine the emotional aspect of some of these conversations or
Yeah.
circumstances, but I think the reality is oftentimes it's a matter of listening for the you know maybe I could revisit and reintroduce this in a
Mhm.
different way, in a better way, in a bigger way, right?
Yeah.
Based on the feedback you receive, even when it is negative.
Yeah, no, I really like it. And what I've heard throughout is how you use every opportunity, even when it's not the most positive of situation, you are you're leading that situation from your end with your brand, right? In this case, you know, um, the kind of reframing the no, right? What is a way to take come to a more strategic understanding to kind of push the matter forward in a different direction, all that. I could speak with you for hours, as you know, Dr. T,
Yeah.
but we've taken a lot of your time. I just have one more question. As you've demonstrated throughout this session, our talk today, that living into your brand, right? Leading with your brand, your actions being aligned to your brand is a great way to promote and have others understand what your brand is about. Do you have any advice or recommendations when you don't have that much time, right, to show
Mm,
people through your actions over time what your brand is? How can you present your brand in a way that hooks someone,
mm.
right? If you are trying to create a really strong first impression about your brand, what are some ways you can show up? What techniques, tactics can you use to give someone a really strong introduction to your brand?
Yeah. This might throw you off, but I think I've said this before. So sometimes again, when I'm in these networking sessions, right? I'm not the again, I don't work the room, right?
Yeah,
However, there are people who are particularly good at selling or marketing themselves in I mean in sort of the traditional way that we're kind of we're conditioned to think is the only way.
yeah,
But what I've noticed is, although we can't always be storytellers, there's a value in being the person who's listening to the story with intent,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so for those of us who are more reserved, and for those of us who do the active listening, that I found
yeah.
that there's a value in that, right?
Mhm,
And so
mhm,
oftentimes what people will say, and funny enough, it is an extension of my brand, right? So as a consensus
mhm.
builder and a facilitator of talent, and systems thinker, I'm forever processing. I'm forever I'm asking questions because I
Yeah.
really want to know how your daughter made it to school after the story. You know what I mean? Like
Right,
I
right.
really and truly I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
Not to mention, I love a good joke. I will laugh at the punchline and I will laugh out loud because I love corny jokes. I love dad jokes. So that is what has worked for me. So but the bottom line, I think what I'm trying to get at is authenticity is the way. And I think
Yeah,
once you, because what your authenticity is not the brand, right? But if
yeah.
you are true to who you are and you have the opportunity to introduce yourself through a
Mhm.
connection or through an interaction,
Yeah,
my hope is at that point, you've gotten yourself to a point where you know who you are and you're operating in that space of authenticity so
yeah,
that what it is they're getting is you, right? Because ideally, you wouldn't need to spend years cultivating and showing people who you are. Ideally, it should take a few seconds for
yeah,
people to get, they may not know quite what it is.
yeah,
They may not be able to call out, people don't know I'm a consensus builder just by, telling me a story about, their commute in the morning, right?
yeah,
But
yeah,
what they feel in that interaction is that I am authentic,
yeah,
at the very least. And at the very least, that
yeah,
is what people are looking for. I think with time, though, what time does is time allows you to build consistency.
yeah,
Time allows them to see that, okay, this is actually how this person shows up each and every single time.
yeah,
So while the first interaction might introduce them to your authenticity, I think what happens with every um, I guess every interaction that follows is the
yeah,
opportunity to see you do it consistently, right? And I
yeah,
think between authenticity and consistency, that is really what sells you, right? That is
Yeah.
really what sells you. It's not necessarily your ability to, I mean, sometimes it is your ability to have knocked out a project that one time, but your
Yeah.
reputation is your authentic self, and it's your consistent self.
Yeah.
And so I think the actual question was the advice, right? Be authentic and be consistent. Show up the same way every single time.
Yeah.
And then more practically and more tangibly, I'm a certified, Gallup Strengths coach. I think that has helped me with the language, right? Like
Yeah.
in terms of the assessment, like that for me, what that did for me was just affirm who exactly it is that I always sense that I am. Prior to having the strengths language, it was other people affirming and going, you're really good at building consensus. I feel like
Yeah.
other people told me what that was before I even knew what that was, right? Like that's
Yeah.
how early
Yeah.
my brand as a consensus builder was. I'm a middle child, one of 5 girls, right? All like type A personalities
Yeah.
with the exception of me, who just listened and was reserved. And so that is something that, has just stood out through the years. So my advice would be those 2 words: be authentic and be consistent.
I love it, Dr. T. I cannot, find another way to wrap up our session than with the way you've articulated the advice. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. It's a treat. It's always a treat to speak with you.
Same.
So thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.